welcome to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kausji. Niaga Spotlight goes through the week in business and future affairs, market watch, industries, analysis and insights. We've got you covered right here on Niaga Spotlight. Well, this week on Future Affairs, we look at fuel subsidy rationalisation in detail. Now, substantial fuel subsidies have been a historic strain on successive Malaysian national budgets. Based on the auditor-general's recent report on the federal government's 2022 financial statement, a total of 62.11 billion ringgit was spent on subsidies last year, with 45.18 billion ringgit on petroleum product subsidies alone. Today's discussion thus focuses on the rationalisation behind removing fuel subsidies and how it can potentially improve economic efficiency via targeted policies rather than dampen key sectors, including Malaysia's automotive industry. Joining me in the studios today for this fantastic discussion are Aiman Abdullah, Managing Editor with Malaysian Motoring, Marina Che Mokhtar, Deals Partner Economics and Policy with PwC Malaysia, and Pankaj Kumar Bipin Chandra, Managing Director with Data Metrics Research and Information Centre, or DARE. Very good morning to everyone. How are you all doing?
Very good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Okay, fantastic to have you all here with us. Pankaj, let's get the ball rolling. I really want to ask about the fact that, of course, the 12th Malaysia Plan midterm review, it actually looks at the fiscal deficit target range being achieved of between 3 to 3.5% of the GDP. And this potentially could actually come quick and come during the time that it needs to happen via actually partial or complete removal of fuel subsidies. Why fuel subsidies?
Well, I think if you look at the target that was set under the 12th Malaysia Plan midterm review, the 3 to 3.5%, first of all, it is a target that the government intends to achieve, but not necessarily all coming from fuel subsidy itself. And I think the government is quite cognizant in terms of where they expect savings to come from. Of course, in terms of expenditure as well, other forms of expenditure, government expenditures, that could provide some savings to the government. And at the same time, I think the government is also looking at enhancing revenue. So if you are able to enhance your revenue, reduce expenditure, plus, of course, subsidies, then perhaps your targeted subsidies can be achieved, between 3 to 3.5% when the 12th Malaysia midterm review ends, which is the 2025 timeframe.
Exactly. So, of course, Marina, our subsidies form 23% of the federal government's operating expenditure in 2022 compared to an average of 10% over the past 5 years. So we're clearly seeing the fact that, cost of living pressures, etc., they're not quite keeping up with a much wider perspective, which is, of course, wages, which would happen to be all the anxiety associated with perhaps removal of subsidies. Let's break that down a little bit.
Yeah, I think I echoed what Pankaj mentioned earlier, that it is not just one measure that the government is taking to manage the overall fiscal growth of the country. But I think just to put in context, this subsidy rationalisation is timely because it is putting a pressure in public purse. We're talking about, I think last year, I think just earlier on, Prime Minister announced close to 81 billion of subsidies. Overall subsidies, not just fuel. And what does it translate to? Just to put in context, is we have about 33.4 million population, it's about subsidizing 10,000 ringgit per household. That is how much the country is spending. And we have been in this mode since 2012 and 2022. A total bill of 200 billion subsidies have been given out. I think that is the sense of right, because people are accustomed to these subsidies. So I think the mode of how we roll this subsidy rationalisation out, although in principle we believe that it's important and timely, it's important to do it right. And at the same time, like what you measure, there needs to be other measures in terms of what do we do with the wages? How do we increase the productivity? How do we make sure that there is no cost pressure to every household?
Or no double inflation. So
that's right.
We'll come back into that in just a bit. But Aiman, now moving on, of course, into your sector, let's look at what are some of the potential issues that could arise for auto industry stakeholders from the proposal for 2024, early 2024, likely January, and us having a fuel subsidy rationalisation program.
I think that as it stands, since the announcement of next year's budget, we've already seen a slight depression in terms of car buying habits and so on, clearly driven by the fact that people are quite anxious about about the possibility of seeing their fuel subsidies removed going forward. There is going to be a huge knock-on effect in terms of household spending, household expenditures as a result of fuel subsidy rationalisation. And I think that as a result of that, if we're already seeing the effects now, we can only expect it to get a little bit worse next year. We've already predicted that this year is going to be sort of the peak in terms of total industry volume for new car sales, but next year will potentially be even more depressed as a result of such policy changes.
So that's very interesting indeed, particularly considering how large a chunk of the GDP the automotive industry actually takes, right? Pankaj, coming back into some thoughts on perhaps impacts on specific sectors as a result of removing fuel subsidies. So there has been some research done within this arena, which actually is pointing to the fact that fuel subsidies would actually hit economic performance, particularly for industries closely attached to the petroleum sector, manufacturing as well. What could be some perhaps stopgap measures, considering the fact that it does seem like the government is definitely going ahead with it come January?
Well, I think if you talk about industries itself, there are certain industries that will be hit, when the government removes the subsidy. But at the same time, the government can provide some sort of assistance if they want to. But having said that, I must also emphasize that fuel as a component of cost in terms of manufacturing may not be that significant. For some of them, maybe just about 5% or 6%. Of course, logistic companies will be pretty much hit, because that's the nature of their business. But that's where the government can step in, to provide some form of help to make sure that they are able to adjust to the mechanism. And at the same time, of course, given time, companies will likely pass on the cost anyway. So there will be some form of implication to the man in the street in terms of higher prices because cost of doing business will go up when fuel subsidies are removed gradually.
Absolutely. Aiman, if I could get your quick thoughts on that, but specifically regarding, of course, the logistics sector, etc., and how that might actually lead to the knock-on impacts and also costs for the average rakyat in Malaysia. We're pretty dependent, particularly in city centres, yes?
Correct. So, for example, we're not as digital as we'd like to, which means we still have a lot of very manual processes, require documents to be sent from point A to point B and so on, which means that even at the very base level, we may be able to see dispatch rider prices going up quite significantly. We're already seeing price hikes and a lack of availability for e-hailing and p-hailing riders and so on. And I can only imagine that this effect is only going to get worse moving forward. They're going to become even more expensive. And again, that's going to impact individuals at every possible level. And so from that point, the knock-on effect on prices for services and goods and so on will be quite significant.
Interesting indeed. Marina, any thoughts to add on?
I do agree that in terms of impact, but I think just to look at it from a more regional perspective.
Sure.
I think
let's cast the net wider.
Because our fuel subsidy is a lot, and we are enjoying quite a bit. And what that has caused is potential overconsumption and some wastages. And this, to a certain extent, forces the businesses to be more productive and be more efficient. So there's a bit of a nudge economics going on here. And, instead of just being comfortable, enjoying these cheap subsidies, electricity or even fuel, it forces the businesses to change the way of doing things and potentially push the digital agenda as well. Of course, you can't get replace dispatch riders overnight, but what I'm saying is that in the overall scheme of things, it has some effect to the competitiveness of our country as well in attracting investors. So I think, but what is more important is what is the policy going forward so that the plans and the investors that are coming in will understand what are they coming into so that they can manage their operations better.
I would like to add to
Sure,
Marina's point.
Thanks, Marina.
And I think, first of all, you have to ask the question, is targeted subsidy the way forward in terms of rationalizing how fuel is sold in the market? Or shall we go full pricing mechanism? All right, that's the question.
All right, so
because
what
targeted subsidy brings a lot of questions in terms of implementation.
Absolutely,
How are you
rolling
going to do
it out.
Yeah, rolling it out. Who gets it? Who doesn't get it? How do you cast the net in terms of whether someone who stays in Kota Baru is entitled and someone in KL is not entitled, for example. Right? Those are the questions. Implementation, administrating, the targeted subsidy itself is going to be a problem.
Yeah.
And of course, you got to have laws, to catch people who abuse the system. All right. Again, so it comes to enforcement.
That's right.
Yeah, so all sort of issues comes together. So then the question is targeted subsidy the right thing?
Okay, so we'll actually get
before
back into
because
that.
have we seen any other country in the world implement targeted subsidies?
Successfully, perhaps not, right? Okay, so I'll hold you to that. But once again, going back into Marina and asking you about the fact that, of course, according to the Ministry of Economy, the plan insofar is for targeted subsidies to be rolled out beginning perhaps Jan 2024 after the rollout of the PADU database system.
That's right.
So let's examine the issues and perhaps merits arising with each of the proposals. Firstly, there's one for based on individual net disposable income and also based on net disposable household income through social protection or assistance schemes. Any thoughts on
Yeah.
these?
The first step, I think, the thinking of understanding the income levels, understanding the household income and the individuals, I think these are important steps to collect in terms of the data. But what is the use of the data is probably the second question in terms of, is it the only parameters that we need to look at in targeting subsidies, for example? I think like what Pankaj mentioned earlier, income alone is not a parameter to show that this is enough in terms of cost of living, because, you know, one person's cost of living in Kota Baru compared to an urban area to another particular area, or even the way where they work are very different. I think everybody's relative cost of living is very different. And hence, how do you ensure that that is fair and transparent with the data? I think what the ministers had also sort of said earlier is to say that the subsidy bill that was enjoyed by the different groups, I think they were saying that T20, because of, you know, they have multiple cars, multiple vehicles, and they were saying that there's going to be potentially 15 to 17 billions of savings just to remove the subsidies away for T20. But again, that is probably a more simplistic view. But in terms of mechanism in implementing it is probably a challenge later on, because you're talking about the M40s and the B40s. M40s enjoy about 40% of the subsidies. And then there's, of course, the whole social media pressure later on in terms of what does it mean? Are you taxing the rich? You know, and giving it to poor. So we don't want that sort of tone to happen as well.
Absolutely understood. And Aiman, so if it comes to an actual targeted subsidy in terms of, you know, cash, etc., what would be perhaps a judicious amount, particularly for the high traffic areas like KL Selangor and the wider financial hubs in Malaysia?
See, to put a number on that sort of thing is really challenging. It goes back to what Marina mentioned earlier about how income alone isn't enough to determine how one's use cases and usages are figured out. Because, for example, one could argue that living in the centre of town means that you have more access to public transport and a wider, more comprehensive public transport network compared to, say, someone who lives out in Kota Baru, since that's the example we're going with.
Sure.
And so there, a vehicle might be, a private vehicle might be a requirement versus living in town. And so does that mean that the person who lives in town with a higher cost of living is therefore entitled to a higher cash transfer versus the person living out of town? That wouldn't really make that much sense either. And again, it just goes to highlight the complexity of this issue, because cost of living is not something that you can boil down simply to how much one spends, how much one's net assets are, or what their income level might be. There are too many factors to determine. And so even to answer your question, I do not have the expertise or knowledge or data to be able to tell you how much is necessary for any given diaspora, any given area.
Sure. So it will be absolutely interesting to see how, in fact, perhaps PADU is going to be able to identify which groups exactly and how to actually roll it out. Aiman, a further question though. Looking at Malaysia's automotive goals and perhaps any recent investments or key points that have come in that are already perhaps seeing a little bit of depression or suppression due to the current mood in the market with regards to this?
I think it's, while automakers are playing their cards very close to their chest, it's quite clear that there is some degree of anxiety and some degree of uncertainty as with regards to how these subsidies are going to be rolled out, if at all. And particularly given the fact the government's been quite vague with their messaging in terms of how they intend to roll out the subsidy system, who will be targeted, who will not. And so as a result, while we have seen some rather healthy investments towards the automotive industry by companies like Geely and Stellantis, for example, what that will mean necessarily for the end user is not quite clear, and how they'll be able, or how they'll need to adjust that in order to work with our market better is not entirely clear just yet. A lot of the companies that we work with, unfortunately, are private companies, and so they're not at liberty to discuss these things
Also
openly.
true.
So,
Absolutely.
but we are aware of the fact there are some discussions with regards to how this is going to work, and there are already significant amounts of money and time being spent to try and figure out product portfolios and so on going forward as a result of these very sudden, very drastic increases or potential drastic increases in fuel prices.
Absolutely. So currently, of course, numbers-wise, we produce close to about 500,000 vehicles every year. And that, of course, has tell-on impacts, particularly considering how much of employment there is in associated sectors as well. Pankaj, I'd like to come into, of course, the last form in which the Ministry of Economy intends to perhaps roll out these fuel subsidies, a combination of household and individual earnings, which will be implemented via a subsidies card. What are some possible issues with a format such as this one?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, the biggest problem is about implementing them. You know, where do you cut it off? Who is entitled, who is not, all right? And then monitoring them, you know, where is the cutoff point? You know, so all these questions will come together. Yeah, so in my mind, targeted subsidy is going to be, while the government is adamant of doing it, but I see challenges in terms of implementation. And I, for one, feel that Malaysia should move towards market pricing over a phase-in period, for example, over the next 18 months or 2 years, you know, and adjust our fuel level slowly. For example, you know, 20 cents every quarter. All right, so in 2 years' time, we will reach market price.
And
right?
20 cents each quarter, Aiman, what would the reflections be perhaps from the general user, Rakyat? Too much, too little?
I think if
We've seen 5-cent hustles to the pump, yes?
Exactly. If we look back at how Malaysians used to rush the pump when we're talking about an increase of 5 to 10 cent per litre, I think even 20 cent per litre per quarter, it might end up in hoarding, for example, which would lead to a huge issue in terms of the dangers of holding on to fuel and so on. We should never underestimate the Malaysian zeal towards savings and discounts of any kind. And I think that would have huge knock-on effects moving forward. But even then, a matter of 20 cents per quarter, it would be a significant adjustment for businesses, especially in order to try and figure out where their margins are and how to adjust their costs accordingly. Yeah. But it would no doubt be a much better system than a targeted subsidy, even by card or by direct cash infusion, for example.
Yeah, to add on the point that Ivan
Sure.
mentioned just now, and to my point, I think if we were to implement a gradual increase, the government can still help the marginalized society, yeah, because you can still provide extra cash transfers to make sure that they are able to cope in terms of the higher prices.
Sure. Marina?
I think I just wanted to build upon Aiman's point that it takes time, and because you're talking about behavioral change, like I mentioned earlier, you know, our rakyat have been accustomed to these subsidies for long periods of time, right. And especially in the last 2 years when there was COVID-19, our bill went up to 70 billion because of the COVID-19. So we need to give them time and ample assurance in terms of how this is being done, and you know, to stick by it. So that it can't be reversing your policy. You know, one day you're going to float, and the other day you say, okay, you're going to put a stop to it. So I think that change needs to be consistent for businesses, for end users as well. And I think like what Pankaj mentioned, we still are not sort of opening up for everyone. There will be the group that is, you know, the Miskin Tegal group, talking about 130,000 of them that we can provide cash transfers more targeted towards them, because we also want to make sure that no one is left behind.
Absolutely. Informed and targeted. So we'll take a quick break. We'll be back right after with Niaga Spotlight. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to Niaga Spotlight. Still with me, Tamina Kaushi, and today, of course, the hot topic of discussion is fuel subsidy rationalization. So, Pankaj, I'm getting back into the conversation. You briefly, of course, mentioned on aligning our prices with the market price. How would that work, ideally speaking, so that it's not too much of a shock to the market, but at the same time, it is actually achievable? And why would this be a better path than going the subsidies rationalization way?
Yeah, okay. So before I go into that, let's look at the pricing mechanism in Malaysia today.
Okay, sure.
We are selling RON 95 at 2 ringgit and 5 cents per litre. Yeah, and if you look within the region, minus Singapore and Brunei, the region has prices of between 440 in Indonesia to as high as 690 in Laos. All right, and other countries too have prices, on average is about 5 ringgit plus, which is more than double than price in Malaysia. And don't forget, all these countries within the region, minus Singapore and Brunei, has lower median wages than us. And yet they are able to cope with market prices. And in fact, they are not only coping with market prices, fuel is actually sold with a tax element in it. All right. So effectively, for example, if RON 95 is 2 ringgit 5 cents, market price without taxes is about 3 ringgit and 30 cents. All right. So if you were to implement even some form of taxation into selling the fuel, you will collect taxes. Not only you will save from subsidy, but you will collect taxes actually. Let's say if you sell at 4 ringgit per litre, all right? So you will collect, let's say, about 50 cents or 70 cents per litre. That's 12 to 15 billion ringgit in revenue, if you talk about going to market price. So now going back to the question about how we're going to implement it, I think the government needs to, if you were to go to that path instead of targeted subsidy, you should communicate to the market, to the consumers, that this is what the government is going to do between January 1st, 2025 to 2024 to 31st December 2025, all right, over 8 quarters. Yeah, you're going to raise prices by 20 cents per quarter every quarter on the first day of the beginning of each quarter. So people already know that price is going to be raised, yeah, and they can adjust it accordingly. And at the same time, the government must also come up with a mechanism to help the B40s, for example, or even those in the poverty line and all that, so that the cash transfers will help them to cope with the higher prices. So that's better mechanism to me compared to having a targeted subsidy, which involves so many variables, yeah, income, households, types of vehicles, as well as geographical differences, too many. Yeah, so I feel that we should look at market pricing mechanism and roll it out gradually.
So market pricing mechanisms. Aiman, I definitely have to ask you, thoughts keying in on this?
I think that would most certainly be a slightly better way to implement this compared to this targeted subsidy system, because at least that would remove the question of who gets subsidies, who doesn't, where do we draw the line, how exactly is it supposed to be calculated, and so on. And I think that, yes, businesses would be slightly better adjusted to be able to understand how much their costs are going to go up in terms of operations and so on and so forth. But I think that the bottom line here is that regardless of how you're looking at this, the primary issue now is that the government has been very vague regarding the messaging about this. So we don't know when these are going to be implemented. We don't really have a very clear timeline. We weren't given much in terms of details during the budget announcement, which means businesses at the moment, I can only imagine that foreign investors are very unclear as to where their costs are going to go, how it's going to change, if it's going to change at all. And it leaves a huge vacuum, as Marina mentioned earlier, for there to be external pressures from certain quarters to politicize the matter rather than look at it from an economic benefit standpoint.
Certainly. And looking at the economic side of things, Marina, so if the government does decide to actually go ahead with reallocating universal fuel subsidies via these targeted cash transfers, what would then be the necessary steps to take to help prevent the double inflation?
I think already there are a lot of noises about the cost of living that's rising. I think just to put in context, like a fresh grad earning 1,005, and they say that they spend half of their wage just to get to work. And what will happen to them if fuel subsidies go up? So managing cost of living is also understanding where should the government park their investment in. I think here is where we discussed even before this, our public transportation, because that is the behavioral change that we want to go to, but you need to make sure that there are proper infrastructure in place. Yes, they have been spending on LRTs and MRTs, but the last mile connectivity is probably not there. The buses is definitely an alternative, but yet in Malaysia we deem buses as no, not a good way of transporting, but when we were in, Western countries, yeah, it's a normal thing, right? So again, the messaging must not just talk about removing of these subsidies, but what is in place for them as alternatives so that they are able to actually earn a living, go to work, earn a living, and actually cope with the other rising prices, especially, even with food and fuel as well.
Clear. It has to be an overall comprehensive perspective, right? And many different parts need to move at the same time. Yes, perhaps, targeted fuel subsidies, either removing them or cash transfers, but at the same time, wages also do need to be going up, not just gradually, but perhaps every quarter as well, just like Pankaj mentioned, right? Okay. Aiman, from there, focusing a little bit on the retargeting of diesel subsidies in particular in phases, which will only be carried out across Peninsular Malaysia, actually exempting Sabah and Sarawak because of their extensive diesel consumption. Thoughts on this vis-a-vis perspectives for end-user concerns when it comes to those in Peninsula's diesel-related industries?
The thing about diesel is that this drives the majority of operations when it comes to businesses and so on in Malaysia. It doesn't matter if you're using 1.5-ton trucks, 3-ton trucks, or these much larger lorries and so on. There are also smaller businesses who use pickup trucks and so on. And so the implications of removing diesel subsidies as drastically as the government appears to want to do would be quite significant. The impact would be rather huge because it would mean that even smaller businesses get pressured, particularly in their very beginning, because these are users who need vehicles like this in order to move about, in order to make smaller loads more efficient and so on. For end users, for example, diesel is particularly useful for those of us who travel longer distances and so on. I run a diesel vehicle, so I understand sort of how much I save when I drive over longer distances and so on. And so for users like me, the implication now is we've purchased these cars because they're more fuel efficient, because they're more cost efficient, and now they're about to become incredibly cost inefficient. And we can't even dispose of them anymore because used car dealers are saying, hey, we're not going to touch your car until the government makes it clear how this is going to roll out. And so what we've seen from automakers and OEMs is that they've already had to make adjustments or begin the process of making adjustments for their product portfolios going forward, because suddenly diesel, which makes a lot of sense for pickup trucks, for people movers and so on, for large heavy vehicles who need that good amount of torque, now they have to make readjustments to potentially move towards large capacity petrol engines, which are inherently inefficient. So I'm not really sure how this works out for the government in the long run. But
particularly considering, of course, the green agenda as well.
Exactly, because if the objective here is to reduce our CO2 emissions, then wouldn't we want to encourage vehicles that are more efficient in terms of fuel usage, but instead we're moving backwards into another direction. And especially for users like this who are particularly, shall we say, money-minded, they might be concerned that the alternatives to an efficient diesel vehicle might be, say, a battery electric vehicle or a hybrid vehicle, for example. These vehicles may not necessarily have the same longevity as a pure internal combustion vehicle. They need their cars to last 10, 15, 20 years, and something with a battery might not be able to do that. And so it leaves particularly users of very large vehicles like this in a bit of a lurch. Which way do they go, since obviously disposing of the car is not an option? So how do they manage this moving forward?
I really appreciate your breaking that down very well, and perhaps what needs to be really considered at this point, considering the immense challenges, particularly for diesel users, perhaps diesel for Peninsula also ought to be exempted. All right. From there, Pankaj, so looking at a fiscal policy standpoint, with the removal or reduction of fuel subsidies, where should ideally the savings be directed towards?
Well, I think savings from fuel subsidy, first of all, of course, the government will use part of it to help, the marginalized. Yeah, there will be some additional cash transfers and all that. But at the same time, whatever mechanism the government is going through, whether it's targeted subsidy or gradual removal of subsidies, the savings are actually meant to reduce our budget deficits. All right? I mean, we are expecting budget deficits of 85 billion in 2024 based on budget that was presented.
Correct.
And if we don't reduce our budget deficit, there'll be other issues that will come along later. Yeah, so we need to have net savings. Yeah, from this move of removing subsidies, whether it's on targeted basis or even gradual basis. Only then we will see improvement in our budget deficits, and the government can reduce amount of money that they borrow, and of course that will also help the country's rating. And of course, outlook by foreigners when they are looking at Malaysia, whether we are managing our financial position well.
And definitely fuel could be a way to start, and we could achieve it in, as you said, 8 quarters.
Correct.
Very interesting. Okay, Marina, digging a little bit deeper, particularly considering Malaysia's current demographic challenges. We've got the aging population on one side, retirement costs, as well as, of course, our exceedingly high NCD rates. Just yesterday, the health minister was talking about the fact that we have the highest rates of diabetes in all across Southeast Asia. So what could be some further considerations for these savings that could potentially arise from the fuel subsidy?
Yeah, I think firstly, I'd just like to agree with what Pankaj mentioned. I think removal of subsidies to a certain extent would improve the fiscal growth of our country. And that gives a lot more confidence to investors and lenders because we have more room to maneuver. And secondly, then where should we channel some of our development expenditures toward more productive sectors? I think for me, even as a mother, I think the 2 key sectors that we as a country should be spending on is basically healthcare and education. Healthcare and education, with the savings that we have of these subsidies, we can build better schools, better hospitals. And of course, when we talk about NCD rates and all that, there's of course another level of discussion when we talk about sugar tax, for example, again, to drive behavioral change because we have this nudge economics that we are proposing. And of course, the other alternative talking about nudge economics is that removal of fuel subsidy, like I mentioned earlier, help for us to be a bit more conscious of how we consume energy, be more energy efficient. I think personally as well, when I heard about the electricity price hike, I was like, I'm looking for appliances that are more energy efficient. Or even, I did try a hybrid car, but there may be issues there in terms of the battery infrastructure in the country. But that's another topic in itself. But again, so I think this would be the few areas that I would potentially channel the savings towards in terms of healthcare, education, and even the green agenda.
Fair enough. And I think what's really important here is that moving forward, considering that January is also just around the corner, all of this needs to be communicated extremely efficiently. Right. So moving in from there, Pankaj, I was interested in asking you this. So while, of course, this fuel subsidy rationalization may incentivize companies or industries to ideally move towards green alternatives, what steps could the government take to ensure that in the meanwhile they remain in the country instead of perhaps going towards other more affordable destinations?
I think as far as the savings that is arrived from rationalizing fuel subsidies, definitely it will help if the government is able to channel it to areas where it is needed most. So I think that will definitely help and limit from people from moving out.
Interesting enough. And Aiman, so Malaysians, of course, we are most dependent on, from all sectors, of course, for the fuel subsidy when it comes to doing the day-to-day, right? Commuting to work, sending children to school, at the same time running errands. So when we look at the efficiency of public transport systems, are we at a juncture yet where we could be looking at the EV version of this moving forward, especially for the medium to long term, because these agendas actually need to already be set down in stone now, rather than worrying about them 5 years down the road?
I think that should we want to move in that direction, the primary issue would be in terms of the geography and being able to roll out this sort of infrastructure and so on. Some bus terminals are not necessarily placed in areas where they have the necessary infrastructure to provide, fast charging and so on for buses and so on and so forth, particularly given the fact that these vehicles consume quite a lot of energy as they move about. But of course, there are significant benefits to moving in that direction, given the fact that buses go through very densely populated areas, and so reducing pollution in those areas and perhaps managing them a little bit better would definitely be a benefit, no doubt, but the implementation, again, of that would be a little bit challenging. It would be good for us to try and look in that direction. It would be great if there was some fiscal policy in order to maybe incentivize logistics companies and public transport providers in order to move in that direction, but it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all solution, and we need to look at basically what works in different areas. There has to be a multi-pathway strategy in order to make our public transport system more comprehensive and to cover more areas and to service more people and to naturally increase ridership in a more efficient manner. But again, as I mentioned earlier, there are lots of challenges to this, and it's certainly something that policy would help to try and clarify, but we also need to see some movement from public transport providers themselves.
Interesting enough. So definitely a multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder sort of an approach. All right. So as we move towards closing out the discussion as well, Pankaj, so let's look at what could be the expected and anticipated cost from the socio-political arena, particularly when it comes to the closer we get to announcing removal or rationalization of these fuel subsidies and managing that in a much smoother way, particularly with consideration towards FDI, etc.
I think Aiman and Marina mentioned just now, I think the communication is very important, is key. Yeah? While the government builds up the momentum in terms of how the fuel subsidy rationalization is going to take place, communicating to the people, consumers, as to how this is going to be done is critical. And Malaysian being, always doing things last minute, that's going to be very critical when you start implementing fuel subsidy, whether in whatever form, whether it's a cut form or how you're going to cut and dice in terms of who is entitled, who is not entitled, when are you going to implement it, there could be some sort of shock in the system when people don't realize that, hey, things have actually changed and I've not got my card, for example, or whatever that is. So the government needs to communicate this well. And if they don't do it, of course, the opposition is going to jump on it and say, look, this is not working, go back to full subsidy. So again, it becomes a political football game.
Understood, of course. And Marina, any final thoughts on what would be the best path towards rolling out? Because it does seem that the government is intent insofar from all the latest updates that we have for it to be targeted subsidies.
I think as a country, we can agree that we need to start thinking about how can we rationalize the subsidies, and it's just the mechanism of it. We need to be transparent and be clear in terms of what are the safeguards that we are putting in rolling this out. And I think more importantly is, although we keep mentioning, because I do advise some private sectors as well, it's not just the cost of doing business that matters to them. What's more important is the ease of doing business and the policy certainty, because they can navigate their way around when they know there is clear path in terms of, okay, the direction that we are going in terms of, is there going to be a fuel subsidy rollout? How is it going to happen? How will it impact the business sectors? And as long as there are other areas in terms of managing the ease of doing business, and the government is thinking about channeling some of these savings towards better digitalization, better management of the investors, I think that gives more confidence, and that is where we can actually move up the value chain as a country towards a higher progressive wage model. Because otherwise we will be stuck in the middle income and low wage cost, and we will never get out of this circle.
Absolutely. Aiman, final thoughts before we close.
I think, as Pankaj and Marina mentioned earlier, I think the manner of implementation is very important here. The messaging is also very important here, because I think a lot of stakeholders at the moment are just sitting a little bit more uncomfortably as a result of not really knowing which way the government wants to go. Businesses will manage one way or another, but the repurposing of some of these savings towards models and policies that will help people increase their wages progressively or increase opportunities to increase wages is certainly very important, because otherwise cost of living is going to go up quite significantly. My personal perplexion at the moment is as to why we're choosing to do this now when we're already suffering through particularly high inflation rates and so on, with people complaining about cost of living, with rental prices, property prices in the central Klang Valley being as high as they are. Is this necessarily the best time to do so? And then if it is this the best mechanism to do it with? Will the government be able to ensure that no one gets left behind? I think that's the bigger question we have to ask now.
All fair points. Thank you very much for your time, Aiman, Marina, as well as Pankaj. Well, that's all we have time for today on Niaga Spotlight. We'll see you again next week with more business analysis and highlights. Have a productive week ahead.